who is talking on to optimize strength and power program. Paul is a reader in strength and conditioning from the University of Salford and world leader in the use of Olympic lifting derivatives to maximize performance. So over to you, mate.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, so Rob's just said that obviously I've done a lot of research relating to weightlifting derivatives, and we're going to touch on that a little bit, so it's not going to be the same thing if you've seen me present before. We're going to be doing something a little bit different. So what we're really going to be looking at here is, initially, why are we going to develop strength in power? What are the key reasons for doing that, and what are the implications of it? And again, looking at it through a sort of long-term athlete development model. How are we going to achieve this? And because this is looking at an optimal way of doing it, we're really looking at not just how, but what are the best and most efficient or most effective ways of doing this? And then touching on the practical application, and you'll see 3 different mesocycles of training. They're purely examples, and we'll have a bit of a discussion around those. So hopefully, by the end of it, you'll again be able to take some of this away and apply it in your own practice. So first of all, why? Why are we going to develop strength predominantly, and how does that lead on to power development? Well, if you look at the basic biomechanical principles, force is mass times acceleration. Mass, your mass is pretty much constant. It doesn't change dramatically. As much as some coaches would like us to get our athletes to put on 10, 15 kilos in a really short period of time, that's not going to happen. So in simple terms, if we increase force production, we increase our ability to accelerate. And that's to accelerate our mass, whether we're sprinting, whether we're jumping, etc. And you will have heard and no doubt read information about the fact that sprinting is horizontal. You're looking at somebody's horizontal velocity. But you're still going through full extension of the hip, knee, and ankle. Certainly on the first few strides, the initial acceleration, top end running, you don't reach full extension. But you're still going through that process. And whether you're sprinting, whether you're jumping, you've got exactly the same movement going there, okay? So the same joint actions, maximal force production, etc. So the key things that we're looking for are the magnitude of force production. Now, that's pretty easy. We just get people stronger. But what we also need to be concerned with is the rate at which we can produce those forces. So force over specific time periods. So in terms of strength and power development, I could have done about 10 slides on each one of these, going through a whole range of studies that show correlations, relationships between strength and power and jumping, tackling, short sprint performance, change of direction performance, etc. But hopefully, everyone's well aware that if you increase strength, whether it's a 1 repetition maximum squat, a 3RM squat, isometric mid-thigh pull peak force, that you generally get an improvement in performance in these different tasks, okay? Along with that, you've also got the fact that the best way of reducing injury risk, as long as the athlete can move adequately, it's never going to be perfect, is to increase strength. If you increase the strength of the muscles, you increase the strength of the connective tissues, and by doing that, you actually increase their resilience to being put in inadequate or insufficient positions. So one of the easiest ways of reducing the risk of injury is to get your athletes stronger and also increase their conditioning, so their aerobic capacity, etc. If we can increase their aerobic capacity, they're not going to fatigue towards the end of a game. At the same time, both of those factors, maximal strength and aerobic capacity, enhance recovery rates. So we've mentioned about playing Saturday to Saturday. That's great. You've got a bit of time to recover. A lot of the time, we don't have the luxury to be just doing Saturday to Saturday. And you've got to recover more between each of these training sessions as well. So the more we can enhance strength, the quicker we can recover, the greater we decrease the risk of injury. Obviously, if you decrease incidence of injury, what you end up with is more time available for training and for competition as well. So, I've sort of alluded to the force-velocity relationship already, and the fact it's not just the magnitude of force that we've got to improve, but it's also the rate at which we can produce that force, which is really important. Now, unfortunately, within most sporting activities, we're looking at less than 250 milliseconds in which to develop the highest forces possible. And if you look at the line on the left-hand side, what you've got is explosive or ballistic training. And this generally comes from a lot of research which has looked at single joint high velocity movements, and in some cases assessed it isometrically to look at how quickly force can be produced in an isometric single joint action. That's not what we do in sport. The other studies generally then focus on heavy resistance training or ballistic training. But again, we don't generally do one or the other. We'll have a combination of the two. And when we have that combination of the two, we'll emphasize either force or we'll emphasize movement velocity by manipulating load and changing exercise selection. So there is a problem with this. And the fact is that if we manipulate just intensity alone, if we go with moderate intensity, velocity should increase. And you think it would become a potentially more ballistic type exercise. But actually, there's a lot of ballistic exercises. If you look at the weightlifting derivatives, we can go above 100% of your 1RM. So we can still do ballistic exercises and make them very high load. And a study we've just submitted for publication, we've actually shown that the heavy load resistance training increases force at the early time points, so 50, 100, 150 milliseconds, etc., far more than doing moderate intensity training. But this was a combination of heavy strength training, heavy weightlifting derivatives. Now, for anyone that's sat there thinking, this guy's nuts, he said you can go above 100% of your 1RM. That's not possible. If you're looking at weightlifting derivatives, where you're doing the pulling derivatives and you're excluding the catch phase, you're no longer limited like you are when you assess a 1RM power clean or hang power clean or whatever lift you assess by catching it. So in a power clean, you're going to catch in about this position, okay? So you've got to displace the bar to about the height of your sternum. If you're using above 100% of your 1RM, you don't have to be able to pull it as far. You can just get to here. There. Okay, so this height. So it doesn't matter how far it gets, you can go well above that load. And that allows you to enhance force production capability in really short durations. The one thing that you've got to do is identify what does your athlete need to do. Do they need to be able to increase maximum force production or force at a specific time point? Now that's a whole other presentation on how you actually identify that and assess that. But if we want to keep it in really simple terms, and because you're looking at athletes of a huge range of body masses, age groups, etc., if you look at the literature, and you can debate exactly where this threshold is, most of the research seems to point to the fact that you're not classed as strong until you can squat around about twice body mass to a parallel squat. Most people can't do that. Certainly not adolescent athletes, although you will find one or two that can lift such heavy loads. So in most cases, the key focus needs to be to increase force production. Now, I'm not suggesting that you just focus on force production, it's changing the emphasis. So you might have 60, 70% of your program focusing on high levels of strength, and then 30 or 40% of your program focusing more on the ballistic and higher velocity movements. So, the more important part, how do we achieve this? Hopefully not like this image actually does it now. Hopefully it's a little bit better technique than that. So, how are we going to actually get our athletes to improve their force production capabilities? If we look at strength initially, we've got a whole range of different activities and exercises we can use. So you can use your normal powerlifting exercises. I'm going to focus from this presentation about lower body, because that's the key area we need to be developing. So squats and deadlifts, they're probably the mainstay of everyone's training program. So we're looking at bilateral exercises where you can use really high loads, relatively simple and easy to teach your athletes. And you definitely get improvements in strength or force production capabilities. Then we've got the weightlifting exercises, clean, snatch, clean and jerk, etc. Do they increase maximal strength? No. Will they increase your ability to improve force at short time points? Yes, definitely. And the reason there's a question mark up there is if you're using the supramaximal loads with the pulls, what we've actually found with the testing we've done is if you're getting somebody up to 120 to 140% of their 1RM, in a power clean, and we have tested loads that high, that's normally comparable to the loads that they squat, and getting close to the load that they would deadlift as well. So you're actually getting similar loading in terms of the external load on the barbell, while you're also getting a more ballistic movement. Single joint exercises, are they beneficial? Probably not, for most cases. If someone's got a specific deficit, a weakness, they've been injured, they need to rehabilitate an area, great. Get them doing some single joint exercise, which may be specific, but most of it doesn't translate to improvement in performance. Exercises such as Nordic curls, yes, definitely have them in your program. There's so much research out there showing that they will create the architectural adaptations and the force production capabilities to not only reduce the risk factors of injury, but also decrease the incidence of injury. So they're definitely useful. And at the same time, they're really quick and easy to do. You throw in 3 sets of 3 repetitions of Nordics. Don't read some of the awful research by some of the physios from 20 years ago, which will do sets of 15. Okay? Now, any of you that have done Nordic curls, imagine trying to do 15 maximal repetitions one after the other. There's no way you're going to perform them correctly. Okay? 3, 4, maybe 5, and then you start cramping. So you need a small dosage. If you need to be time efficient, 3 sets of 3, and you get the responses you want. Eccentric training. Obviously, Nordics fall under that. Other types of eccentric loading, so supramaximal work using things like a K-box, J-hooks with extra weight hanging off the end of the bar. They seem to be effective, but there aren't any really good longitudinal studies showing that they will be. They're certainly not detrimental. Biggest problem is, if they really add a lot of eccentric loading, you're going to get a lot of additional muscle damage. It's going to take you longer to recover between that training session and the next session. And actually, unless you're already pretty strong, there's probably not much point doing that and throwing it in there. Although, it can be a nice, interesting, fun challenge for your athletes and it gives them something different to do, but throw it in at the right time so you don't leave them feeling broken the next day. As soon as you're all working with rugby players, you're probably okay. If it was football players, they'll all be coming in telling they've torn the muscle groups the same as they do with the Nordics. So you're probably going to be okay and quite safe there. So if we then look at plyometric exercises, are they going to improve force production or maximal strength? No. There's not enough loading there over a long enough period of time. But they will improve your ability to produce forces quickly, but it's the force that you can already produce. So if we look on the power side, power lifts, squats, deadlifts, etc., do they improve power output? Yeah, if you're not strong. So if you get somebody stronger, you improve their ability to produce force, and you get an increase in acceleration, higher velocity. If you've got higher force, higher velocity, obviously, power goes up. But if you're already strong, and they're already squatting up towards twice body weight, you're probably better off putting far more emphasis on the power-based exercises, lighter loads, higher velocity movements. Weightlifting at that point is definitely going to be more beneficial because you're moving the weight as rapidly as possible throughout the entire range of motion, and the aim is to displace the bar as high and as fast as you can during any of these exercises to get maximal displacement if you're including the catch, so you can actually then catch the bar. Single joint exercises for power, don't bother, okay? You're not going to develop power. Just to give you an example, I've seen, and I'm just looking to make sure that the strength coach isn't in the room, a rugby league strength coach before saying they're developing power for the deltoids, for the shoulders. And they've gone from a hypertrophy phase, doing this, lateral raises, build the delts up, make them look a bit bigger, to power. Just because you've added velocity, that doesn't make it a power exercise, okay? So be sensible about the selection and the way you perform it. Eccentric exercises, if you use accentuated training, so you create that overload, extra load on the way down, it may create a potentiation effect. So if you're using something like J-hooks, which when you squat down, the weight then falls off the bar, brilliant. On the way back up, you've got neurological potentiation, you haven't got a huge amount of fatigue, but again, there's no long-term training study at the moment that shows us that results in greater improvements in performance than you might get from other means. And then plyometric training, definitely improves performance, okay, in plyometric and ballistic power-based tasks. But the nice thing is with plyometrics, you can actually hide a lot of your plyometrics. You can put them in your warm-ups. If you're working with professional athletes, they're warming up a couple of times a day. Amateur athletes, at least once every training session. So build some plyometrics into it, and also build in where you're focusing on landing mechanics. If you want to reduce the risk of injury, the landing of the plyometric tasks is essential, okay? If they're collapsing, you think Rodri showed earlier, somebody playing volleyball, and everyone pulled a face and made a bit of a noise when she landed and her knee collapsed into the valgus. Train them to land properly, especially with much younger athletes. You can work more on expressing force quickly in the power-based focused plyometrics later on. So the bit everyone's interested in, hypertrophy. Forget all that strength and power rubbish. Let's get our athletes bigger and increase momentum. So hypertrophy is really useful, and it's going to set the foundations for everything else you do. You're going to get an increase in cross-sectional area, which increases your force-generating capacity. So you've got to make sure they've got that. You're also going to increase muscular endurance. And there's definitely an endurance component to what you do, or to what the athletes do. But with that, if you increase force generation capacity, you'll increase the number of reps they can perform at a lower load anyway. So you'll still get some increases in muscular endurance just with general strength training. One really useful thing with youth athletes, or inexperienced, because you could have a 15-year-old who hasn't done a lot of stuff in the weights room, is the fact that you're performing more and more repetitions. So it's easier to acquire the skill or refine the skill of the exercises you're performing. Problem is, the way that probably everyone in the room was taught is when you're teaching people to perform different exercises, start off with higher reps, sets of 10, 12, 15 reps. Much easier to perform technique. If it's a highly skilled activity, anyone fancy doing sets of 15 for cleans? And from the look on a few people's faces, no. Unless you do CrossFit, and then you might do maximum for the next 3 minutes or whatever, but that's a completely different conversation altogether. So the problem is, if you're doing really high repetitions, technique will break down as you progress through the set. But don't worry about that. We'll come to what we can do with that in a moment. And speaking to Rodri earlier, he actually applies this same principle that we'll go on to discuss in a moment when he is coaching youth athletes anyway, just so that you can give them more feedback. One of the key things here is, though, is you get rapid improvements in technique when you're actually giving them feedback and you're coaching them effectively. So give them continuous feedback, and ideally, if you've got a really nice setup and you've got, let's say, ideal scenario, we converted this room and you've got 7 or 8 weightlifting platforms running down the right-hand side, and you've got them in groups of 3 or 4 on a platform, give the athletes ownership. Get them to give each other feedback. Because if I'm turning around and I'm coaching Rob and I'm giving him feedback telling me his technique is awful, but obviously it wouldn't be quite that polite, when I get up there and squat next, he's going to give me exactly the same criticism. So I'm going to make sure I work much harder and I try and get my technique as good as possible. So it's a really good way in terms of having peer-on-peer feedback and mentoring during a training session to improve their performance. And then you make them move far more efficiently. So the key thing is that the hypertrophy strength endurance is going to set the foundation for your strength and power development. Some other things we need to consider in terms of these different types of training is with strength training, are they competent to perform heavy loads? Now this isn't about age, it's about experience in their technique. And somebody mentioned earlier, look at the athlete that's in front of you. Can they perform these exercises safely, competently, effectively? If they can, you can load them up more. If they can't, irrespective of their age, don't load them up. Refine their technique first. But the issue with normal strength training is there's a deceleration phase. If I'm squatting a heavy load, I've got the bar on my back, I squat down, I come up. If I don't decelerate towards the top of the movement, it's no longer a squat, it's some form of squat jump, loaded. So you'll always get a deceleration phase. Normally, from about there, up. And it's those joint angles which replicate what you're going to do in most of the sporting tasks. So there is a limitation with this type of training. But again, it sets a foundation for power development afterwards. Weightlifting, how many people can get in that position? I won't get a show of hands, but certainly not everyone. And not everybody as competently as that. But in terms of a long-term athlete development model, if you chose to, you should have the time over a period of years to be able to develop your athletes to do this if you wanted to, but you don't have to, okay? We can still do these variations. We can exclude the catch phase if our athletes can't perform the catch, and it's not a problem, it's not detrimental. Then with your ballistic training, where you're actually going to be jumping with load or bench throws. Anyone do bench throws with their athletes? Make sure that there's no TVs or anything on, or there's no scantily clad women walking through the weights room at that point, because they won't watch the bar anymore. They'll be watching what's going on elsewhere, and they won't catch the bar if you miss it. But if you're doing squat jumps, you've got the issue of landing with that additional load, and if they've already got poor landing mechanics, that's probably not going to be brilliant. And then with plyometrics themselves, you're going to get a higher jump height than you would from any ballistic training, any loaded counter-movement jumps, and therefore the forces on landing are much higher. So you've got to make sure they've got appropriate landing mechanics, and if they haven't, if they're going through that period of peak height velocity, you're probably going to have compromised landing capabilities. So you might want to decrease the emphasis on maximizing jump height then, and increase the emphasis on landing correctly and safely. So, that looks a bit strange on the screen there. What we can do with this type of training is actually go on and use cluster sets. So, if you haven't heard of cluster sets, normally used for maintaining power and velocity while you're training. So if we get you doing a set of 6 repetitions, velocity will start to decrease as you go through the repetitions with a near maximal load. That sort of makes sense. You're going to fatigue, force and velocity will start to decrease. But can we use it in other scenarios? And if you look at the work that James Stefano did over the last sort of 3, maybe 4 years, he's put it in place. So you've got at the top 3 sets of 12 repetitions at 60% of 1RM. Doesn't take too long to get through that, your standard set format for hypertrophy or muscular endurance. And then, to maximize velocity or try and maintain power, they've split it up into clusters. So each set is now subdivided in group B into 4 30-second rest, another 4 30-second rest, another 4. Or, in C, 2 reps, 30-second rest. I know which I prefer. The 2 reps, 30-second rest is much easier, feels far less fatiguing. But it depends what your goal is with this. So if we look at what happens with this, you've got exactly the same thing happening up here in terms of velocity as you have with power. So it makes sense that power will follow the same trend as velocity does. So if you look up at cluster set 2, so cluster sets for doing the 2 repetitions, 30-second rest. 2 30-second rest, repeat until you've done your 12 repetitions. There's pretty much minimal change in velocity across a set of 12 repetitions. If we look at the cluster set where it's 4 reps, you get a slight decrease in velocity by the 4th rep, and then it picks back up by your 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th decrease, and so on. So force, velocity, and power are maintained better when you do a cluster set. Smaller clusters, longer rest periods, you maintain velocity. But which is better for hypertrophy, first of all? If we're looking at this for hypertrophy, surely you want velocity to start to decrease. Because if velocity is maintained, time under tension is maintained. There's less mechanical stimulus. If we actually see a progressive decline in velocity across a set, the muscles are working harder for longer as you become fatigued. So for hypertrophy, it makes sense not to use clusters because you're decreasing the stimulus and it makes the set easier. But you could be evil and you could make them do more repetitions. If we then look at what's better for strength, maintaining force production capability. Well, actually, you'll get less metabolic fatigue. So in season, if you were going to do something hypertrophy related, this may be a better option using the clusters because you don't get that same accumulation of lactic acid, etc. And in terms of power, you're probably better using the clusters, 2 30-second rest, 2 30-second rest to maintain velocity. But are you going to use a back squat at 60% of your 1RM to train power? Hopefully everyone's going to say no. That would be an awful exercise because you're not getting high enough forces or high enough velocities. And it's not going to massively increase force production capability. So you're probably thinking, why is he showing us this then? Well, what Tofano went on to do is be evil and said, right, let's increase the intensity. Let's get people doing sets of 12 repetitions with 80% of 1RM. Not possible, is it? 12 reps at 80%, you can't do it. You can when you do it as a cluster. So the study you followed it up with used your traditional 12 repetitions, 60% of 1RM, everyone could do that. They piloted this with 67% of 1RM, which would be your normal 12 repetition maximum. You can't do 3 sets. You probably get 12, 10, 8. Then they did clusters on this one, looking at sets of 4 repetitions at 75% of 1RM, and then went up to 80. 80, 2, 30-second rest, and another 2. Keep going till you've done 12 reps. Now, I'll be honest. When I first read this, I thought, you're not going to be able to do that, and you're certainly not going to be able to do it for 3 sets. You can, and surprisingly, it doesn't feel too bad until you try and get out of bed the next day. And seriously, think about the volume there. 80% of 1RM, normally you might be training doing 6 reps. So you've just doubled the volume, do it that intensity. It leaves you feeling broken the next day, and even worse the day afterwards. Trying to sit on the toilet, trying to go down the stairs is not pleasant. You certainly wouldn't want to turn up and go into a contact situation. So if you choose to do this, build it up slowly. Either build up by doing your first lot at 60%, the next session might go 65, 70, 75, 80, or if you're starting 80% of 1RM, maybe do 6 reps as sets of 2 or 3. And your next session, add an extra cluster in until you get to your 12 repetitions. And you can slowly and incrementally create overload without your athlete feeling like they're completely fatigued the day afterwards. Now, the nice thing is with this, you end up getting in there a strength training load, which will give you the mechanical stimulus you want for the adaptations to your muscles and your tendons. And at the same time, you've got a high enough volume to get hypertrophy in there. But more importantly with youth athletes, you've got a 30-second rest period. You can reduce it to 20 if you're evil, and they'll still get through the set. You've got a 30-second rest period where you can coach the athlete. So if the athlete's performance would normally deteriorate slightly, if they're doing sets of 6 repetitions at this load, they do 2. You're telling them, let's say it's a front squat, they're starting to go into a bit of thoracic flexion, they're starting to lean forwards, the heels are just starting to lift off the floor. You've got 30 seconds to give them 1 or 2 coaching cues, give them a bit of praise if they were moving really well. Somebody mentioned earlier about using a gym aware and tendo units. You can tell them about the velocity, you can motivate them. If you've got 2 people of similar heights, you can have a really short duration training session. Because Rob's a little bit taller than me, but he can squat down lower and pick it up from lower in the rack. And if we were doing it together, I can do 2 reps, Rob can step in and do 2 reps, then I can step in, then Rob can do it. And we can get through a workout quicker and give each other feedback at the same time. And again, you get your athletes taking ownership of what they're doing a little bit more then. So it's quite an efficient and effective way of doing it, but do not, first time, do 3 sets of 12 at 80% of 1RM. Not unless you really don't like the person you're getting to do it, okay? So if you don't like your coach and you want to get him to try it first, maybe do it that way round, or if it's the physio you don't like, whoever. But it will leave your athletes feeling broken the next day. They'll get through the set and think this is awesome. And you should get a decent hypertrophic response from it as well. So, the one thing to bear in mind, at the 75% of 1RM, and as you can see from this, it actually means it takes you longer to get through your 3 sets. And even longer still, when we're trying to get through the clusters of 2 30-second rest, 2 30-second rest, etc. But after a couple of weeks, when you're up to doing 80% of 1RM for 12 reps, you don't need to do a lot else. You might go and do your Nordic curls, or you might go and do some Romanian deadlifts. That's probably your leg workout pretty close to being done the first few times. So even though it takes a bit longer, because the volume's so much higher, you don't need to then go and say, do you know what, I'll go and do this on a leg press now. I'll go and do it with some lunges or some split squats. So just in summary, if we then look at the results here, you've got significantly higher forces, mean and peak force, higher velocity, lower velocity, and time under tension increased noticeably during cluster set 2. So what we end up with is a much greater hypertrophic stimulus with also a much greater stimulus for force production. It's not surprising you a slightly lower peak velocity and mean velocity because we're now at 80% of 1RM as opposed to 60 or 75%. But a great stimulus to try and get both hypertrophy and strength in there to set the foundation for development of power. So, how do we put this into our training program? Well, first of all, what does your athlete need to focus on? Identify that for the group of athletes or the individuals. But again, most people, you're going to use a standard sort of periodized approach. So you're going to start off looking at a strength endurance hypertrophy phase, then you can do more of a general strength, and then a power phase. So we're going to go through some form of phase potentiation. If you look at that as like a block periodized model, the traditional block, we're going to do some strength endurance work, increase physical work capacity, and use that to refine technique. Now we can use the clusters in there if we want to. That doesn't have to be 80% of 1RM. We can do lighter loads. If we're doing sets of 10, you can do 2 clusters of 5. And you can then use that to try and make sure that your athlete gets a bit of feedback, refines technique, and the work capacity goes up. Then we'll move on to strength, because we want to increase force production capability so we can get greater acceleration. And you get greater acceleration then going into that power phase. Then when we move into the power phase, hopefully we're going to express that additional force production capability by using movements where we're going to actually move at higher velocity and generate that force rapidly. But we also need to maintain strength. And a lot of people forget that. Take a strength stimulus away for a period of weeks, and your force production capability goes down. If your ability to produce force starts going down during a power phase, your ability to accelerate decreases. And that's no good if you're trying to move at high velocity, because you could end up with a decrease in power during the power phase, which would make no sense. So you still need some stimulus for strength in there. So this is a basic example. This isn't to be prescriptive. So we've got in there a pull variation. By a pull variation, that's any of the weightlifting pulling derivatives. You can choose, is that a pull from the floor? Is it from the knee? Is it from mid-thigh? Do you start at the knee? Or do you start here and do it as a hang variation where you dip to the knee and then go through the movement? Which way do you want to do it? What's most appropriate for your athlete? That depends on their capability. If you're finding that you're trying to do a hang variation, and as they do it, instead of maintaining posture, they go into flexion. So instead of doing that on the way down they go and flex. End up in a flex position. You don't want to do the hang position, and you don't want to start doing that with a higher load. So go to static, coach them, give them a bit of feedback, and then make them rapidly triple extend from there. So any of the pull variations will be fine. You can choose clean grip, snatch grip, whatever you want your athlete to do. Now, you can put clusters in there. If you're doing pulls from the floor, the technique definitely will break down if you're up at 80% of 1RM and you're trying to do 12 reps. So again, cluster it if you need to, get them to give each other a bit of feedback. Again, myself and Rob could get up. I could do a set of 4 repetitions. Rob can do a set of 4. Then I go again, then Rob does, and I do, then Rob does. You only get a 20, 30-second rest in between. But we can also give each other feedback on it. If you've got something to assess the velocity of the bar there, we can also compete against each other. Then we probably need the next 2 minutes to try and make sure we can actually get our breath back, while the next 2 people go and do exactly the same thing. So you can use this quite effectively. In between some of these exercises, while we're resting, while the next 2 people go, and me and Rob are recovering, we might do some landing mechanics. So we might do some hop and hold. Stand on one leg, hop forwards as far as you can, and try and stick the landing. Give each other feedback on your lower limb control, knee valgus, etc. So you're still getting some additional stimulus in there and trying to reduce the risk of injury. Then we'll do a squat variation. That's up to you what you want to do. Depends on the philosophy within your club. That can be back squat, front squat. Front squat's a little bit easier if you're worried your athlete might drop the weight. because it's really easy to dump the weight in a front squat just by dropping your elbows down and letting it land on the platform. Back squat's a little bit trickier. You need to make sure you've obviously got all the safety bars set at the appropriate height, etc. So any squat variation you want, that could be split squats, lunges, whatever is your exercise of choice. And then in between the sets of that, looking at some drop landings. Now again, that squat variation is using that cluster approach. It's got 3 sets of 12 repetitions down. That wouldn't be week 1, certainly not at 75, 80%. So you'd slowly build up to that over a period of time, depending on what volume they were used to doing. It's the increase in volume which is the problem and causes severe DOMs. Then you might move on to some Nordic counter movement jumps and some Nordics. You can actually get through a workout of that sort of variation within just over 30 minutes. It's quite fast-paced, but you can get through it without too much problem. So if we look at how this would transition into a strength phase, again, you've got a pull variation. Now above 100% of your 1RM, 3 sets of 3 to 5 repetitions. So nothing too excessive, but again, it's 100% of your 1RM or higher because we're focusing on force production, maximizing force. And this is as a percentage of your 1RM power clean or hang power clean, whatever you choose to test your athletes on. There is no standard protocol for doing a 1RM pull, because what somebody would do is a deadlift, stand up, and then shrug, and look a bit strange. As much as you may occasionally see in the literature people, well, not in the literature, but in social media, etc., people discussing it, it should always be based off your 1RM power clean or hang power clean. Then again, you've got a neuromuscular control type exercise in there, single leg Romanian deadlift with whatever load for a dumbbell. Shouldn't be fatiguing, you're looking at control. Making sure that as they're doing it and doing this, that they're not rotating and opening the hips out. So doing it with really good technique. Then again, onto a squat variation. We've got the pull first, because it's going to be the most physically demanding and the most stressful on the neurological system as well. So then we move on to the squats. 3 sets of 5, around about 85% of your 1RM. If your athlete isn't particularly competent, drop the load a little bit. Otherwise, go with around about 85% of 1RM. Luckily, that falls in with what was mentioned earlier about the best adaptive responses coming from 80 to 89. That wasn't planned. And then moving on to something like a jump shrug. So a jump shrug, you start standing upright. If you're not aware of the exercise, you go down to the knee in a Romanian deadlift position, and from there, you rapidly triple extend and aim to jump. If you've got adequate knee extension in that position, the first thing that happens when you tell somebody to jump is they'll perform the transition or the double knee bend and get to the second pull position. So you get them to do that exercise. Their aim is to jump and get as high as they can. So it's a really ballistic exercise where you get minimal, if any, deceleration. The deceleration will come when you go to plantar flexion because your calf muscles aren't strong enough to keep accelerating your mass. Then on to counter movement jumps and some Nordics at the end. You can see the Nordics haven't changed. The Nordics were 3x3 before, they're still 3x3. You're not going to do 3x15 in a strength endurance or hypertrophy phase, and you'll get more overload as you get better at performing the Nordics, as you get lower to the floor. And then moving on to power. So now we've got a jump shrug first. So the jump shrug now, we've decreased the load. If you look at the research that Dr. Tim Suckermel's done, it showed that the highest velocities and powers achieved in any weightlifting derivative comes in the jump shrug, probably because you are aiming to jump and leave the ground. And as you would imagine, as you progressively decrease load, you get a higher velocity. So you get maximum velocity around 30% of 1RM. They'll be jumping to a decent height, hopefully. In the research that Dr. Suckermel's published, I think they were jumping about 30 centimeters with 30% of 1RM hang power clean. So a pretty decent athlete, so you've still got to make sure they can stick that landing. If they can't stick the landing, and they're landing with a stiff strategy or any type of valgus, increase the load. That might sound really weird. If they've got poor landing mechanics, increase the load. If you increase the load, the forces on landing decrease because there's a disproportionate decrease in jump height with an increase in load. So they went up to 80% of 1RM. 80% of 1RM, the jump height was about 5 centimeters. You're landing from a 2-inch drop. So actually the loading on the force plate on landing is much less than if you've got a 30% of 1RM. Moving on, making it a little bit more explosive with the lower limb control exercise, triple hopping holds. So you hop 3 times, stick the landing on the third one. Not land on the third one there and then walk away. Actually stick the landing and make sure they can hold it. So they've got that lower limb control with a bit of horizontal momentum as well. And then moving on to hang power cleans. 70 to 80% of 1RM is about optimal for hang power cleans to get the highest power outputs and the highest velocities. But again, you can cluster them. You can't do 6 reps and maintain velocity and power. So either do 2 lots of 3, 3 lots of 2, whatever's appropriate for your athlete. If you've got the ability to measure barbell velocity, measure it and use that as your guide. If you get a drop off of 10% from your peak velocity, let them rest. And then you've still got a squat variation in there. Now it's just 3 sets of 3. Small dosage, just enough to maintain force production capability with the high enough neurological stimulus to help maintain that. That shouldn't be fatiguing. If you've done those horrible clusters and ended up doing sets of what equates to 12 repetitions at 80% of 1RM, 3 sets of 3, easy. You're walking out the gym feeling like you've hardly done anything on the squats. And then a few more of those exercises are the drop jumps now, more of a neurological stimulus, hit the ground and rebound. If your athlete's capable of doing that, if they're landing and then jumping out of it, and they can't get that initial touch of ground and get off the floor as quickly as they can, like they land on a hot coals or whatever, or they land and tuck jump, rather than actually land and jump, probably go with an easier exercise. So, as I said, these are just examples of the exercises you can do. Instead of a jump shrug, if they're not competent at that, it could be a mid-thigh pull, it could be another variation of the exercise. It could just be a hex bar jump squat, whatever you want to get them to do, whatever they're capable of. Squat variation, again, it could change throughout the exercises, throughout the phases, or you could stick with exactly the same exercise. If you're worried in the strength phase, back here about doing the 5 reps at 85% of 1RM, what if they fail? Again, make sure it is a front squat. They can just drop the weight as long as no one stood too close to them. Worst case scenario, they break the weights. If you haven't got decent weightlifting discs, it's much better that they break that than themselves. So again, you can see how the clusters can be put through this entire type of training, whether it's for hypertrophy, for strength, for power, and you should get a much greater adaptive response. Again, the key is making sure that you're not massively increasing the volume in that hypertrophy phase with that additional loading. In these phases, you're fine. You're just trying to maintain the velocity of the movement. So that wasn't bad on the timing. I've got 2 minutes left. So any questions?
Any questions from the floor? I've got one. So obviously with the work that you've done with Tim Suckerwell that you mentioned there, doing the full lifts, teaching the full lifts for these guys that are working with athletes every day, is it worth going the full hog and teaching the full lift, or should we be thinking more from the work that you guys have done on derivatives?
Okay, so pretty simple answer really. Yeah, teach the full lifts, teach everything. All the variations and all the derivatives gives you something extra in the toolbox. Now, luckily, a really good time, and yesterday we actually had a paper accepted where we've compared doing the full lift, where you include catching the bar. So we split them into 2 groups. If you had one group doing a power clean, the other group did a clean pull. So they started from the floor, came all the way up and finished there and didn't have to drop and catch. If it was a hang power clean, they'd start here, down to the knee, up and catch, or it would be a hang pull, etc., for whatever exercises. Did that over an 8-week training period. Both groups improved significantly, large meaningful differences across 8 weeks of a competitive period, but no difference at all between exercises. So if you caught, you got a similar adaptation to if you just did the pulling variation. Some people didn't like just doing the pulls. They didn't feel like they were finishing the movement. They didn't feel like it gave them the intention to get full extension and then drop underneath the bar. So there's definitely an individual preference. Those of you that work with senior rugby players will find that some of them can't start on the floor. They can't get down into that position without getting in a flex position, so go from the knee. Or they can't get in the front rack position. They certainly can't get in the overhead snatch position, in which case you can still use the weightlifting derivatives where it excludes the catch phase and still get exactly the same benefits from it. Although, saying that, Dr. Sukamal has already started data collection for a follow-up study. We published a paper last year in the Strength and Conditioning Journal looking at how you can train the force velocity curve by manipulating exercise variation and load. And obviously you can go above 100% of your 1RM if you exclude the catch. So if you're going above 100% of your 1RM excluding the catch, we can focus more on force production capabilities. You wouldn't do a power clean with 30% of 1RM because the barbell would end up here somewhere and you'd probably take your chin out with it. But if you're doing something like a jump shrug or a hang high pull where you let the bar come up, you can use a lighter load and emphasize velocity. So we are doing a follow-up study where we've got basically the same training program, but with a third training group where they emphasize velocity and force by manipulating exercise and load. So that's looking promising, but there's no sort of right or wrong. You shouldn't catch or you should catch. Both are as effective as each other if you equate volume and intensity. The main thing is if you've got time to develop it with a long-term athlete development model, you should really be able to throw in, as long as they're not injured, all those exercise variations, which also overcomes a lot of the monotony and stuff. If you're going in and all you're doing is a mid-thigh pull, doing this every training session, you're going to get bored to tears. They're not going to buy into it, they're not going to put the emphasis in. If you give them different variations, then you're going to hopefully overcome some of that monotony and boredom.
Cool. Last chance for questions. No? Perfect. Put your hands together for Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you.